Hello and welcome back to The Hatch. I'm Rosie Murphy.
And I'm Sammy Roth, and this is the podcast where we talk about Lost.
It's season 6, and we've reached episode 15, Across the Sea.
Yes, this is the famous, infamous, iconic Across the Sea episode with the Jacob and the Man in Black.
We're excited to talk about it, and I'm potentially even more excited that we've got Tucker Gates, who directed this episode, back to tell us a little bit about what he thought went well and what he thought maybe didn't go so well.
Yeah, you'll remember we had Tucker on back at the beginning of the season talking about The Substitute, which he also directed, and we're happy to have part 2 of that conversation here.
Let's get into it. We start every episode of The Hatch with a hot take about the episode we've just watched. This is an eminently hot takeable episode, but Sammy, what is yours?
Yes, eminently hot takeable indeed. Well, I'll start with something that doesn't quite get at the core of what's going on here, but I know I've complained a number of times this year about answers to questions that I thought were unsatisfying or unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And credit where credit is due, I thought the explanation of the origin of the frozen donkey wheel this episode, it was very satisfying. We, going back to season 4, we had Locke, and then later Ben, and then later Locke in season 5 going down to turn that giant wheel under the ground to move the island, and it was like, how did that thing get there? What's that doing there? Not a question that I know that we necessarily felt like we had to have an answer to, but to learn that this was installed by the Man in Black and his people in their efforts to tap into the weird thing happening with metal on the island and to try to steer away from the place, that's pretty freaking cool. I dig that. I like that we got that.
Yeah, no, I agree. The idea that this is a mechanism that people have been trying to build and trying to use on the island for thousands of years makes sense. And it doesn't feel like anyone was trying too hard with that explanation.
It didn't. And somewhat less perfect and trying too hard, that's a good turn of phrase. One where they were trying, I think, harder, but which I still ultimately felt reasonably satisfied by was the origin of the smoke monster explanation given this episode. Yes, is it a little cringy to watch the giant column of black smoke emerge fully formed, with its normal mediocre CGI from the weird looking light at the heart of the island thingy? Yes, it's a little cringy. But as these things go, the whole how the Man in Black became the smoke, that it had to do with Jacob's anger over the death of their mother and feeling like he had to do something to his brother only could do something to his brother that was worse than death because death wasn't an option, and that's how he became this sort of infernal creature. I'm satisfied by that explanation. I've got other questions and complaints surrounding that part of that story, but overall I was okay with that one too.
I think I agree on the whole, which transitions nicely into my take, which is that I really am not a big fan of the Adam and Eve explanation.
Same.
It's not a mystery I needed an answer to. It's something that we haven't revisited since season 1, and I, as a viewer, had largely forgotten about it. And to learn that those are the bodies of Jacob and the Man in Black's mother, and then the Man in Black's body, which he abandoned when he became the smoke monster, but he's not dead. And the notion of Adam and Eve, implies that they were a team and that they were
a couple, honestly.
A couple working together to build this civilization, and that it was instead a mother and son, and then the son ran away from the mother, and the mother destroyed the civilization of people that he was living with, and then he killed her. That is not Adam and Eve to me. And it is an explanation for how these two skeletons got there, but that to me is a bit of a reach.
I couldn't agree with you more. The aspect with the Man in Black's body, even though he's still alive, and they make a point about how he's still alive and that it wasn't killing him. It felt like they were trying real hard to answer the Adam and Eve question, and that this was the best they could do. The backgammon piece was the most interesting part, honestly. Can I actually share a quick theory that I had that's related to what you just talked about with the mother destroying his civilization?
Please.
Yeah, this is way out there. I don't know if this is hot takey, but it's definitely out there. The whole thing where the mother apparently managed to kill all of the people in the Man in Black's group and torch their village and also fill in the well with dirt. I was thinking how did this single human character accomplish all of that? It doesn't seem possible. And it occurred to me, what if what if she also like had her own monster form? And what if the reason why she makes Jacob promise to never go down into that hole and talks about it as worse than death and, to the heart of the island, how terrible it would be to happen to you if that going down there would be worse than death. What if she knows that and she's so terrified for Jacob on his behalf because that happened to her, because she went down there and also, like the Man in Black this episode, transformed into some, horrible, destructive being, and that was also how she was able to go and kill all those people and wreak all that destruction.
Oh, that's fascinating. I like that a lot.
Thank you.
I almost like the idea of the mother being some sort of supernatural monster or having the ability to become a supernatural monster. That to me is more satisfying than I had a mother and she was crazy, which we talked about a few weeks ago as, an explanation that we get from the Man in Black as John Locke. There clearly is sort of a despair in her that is not, in my opinion, very well explored in this episode. Like, her motivations are just very unclear to me.
Agreed.
The scene that really makes that evident to me is when she and Jacob are sharing the wine outside the entrance to the light. And she tells Jacob that, you don't really have a choice. Sorry, this is your mandate now, and that's all there is to it. You can't say no, which is interesting when we think about how Jacob always says that his candidates do have a choice, right? And at the same time, he was her second choice, and they both know it. But then the orders that Jacob get are that you have to protect...
What's down there?
Life, death, rebirth. It's the source, the heart of the island.
I think there are... I'm just going to get fully into it now. I think this episode works if we sort of take the Adam and Eve framing and we treat it as a myth. And we are able to step back far enough and say that this is like the founding myth of the island, the way that the book of Genesis is the founding myth in Judeo-Christian tradition, right? But it's not really presented that way. It's presented as concrete answers to these questions in this supernatural sort of sci-fi show. And I think that's why it's unsatisfying. But if we're able to read this as not literal, right? But this is, and you think about the way that those ancient texts are written that are sort of then it would be perfectly normal if the mother didn't have a name, right? It would just be and the mother said to Jacob, when I pass you this cup and you choose to drink it, your duty then will be to protect it. I can hear that in a reading from a pulpit in a way that seems more natural than to hear it in these lines spoken on screen.
I like that because, and I don't know, not being someone who makes television, I don't know what they would have needed to do to make it read as founding myth. But yeah, there was definitely parts of the dialogue of this episode, frankly, especially strongly in the child actor scenes, where, no offense to these kids, but they just really had trouble selling it. But even with some of the adult, actors, where it just felt really those are the words they're saying. This feels it was written by children or something.
Well, it feels simplistic in the way that those myths kind of feel simplistic, right?
Right. I'm agreeing with you is what I'm doing. I just don't know how they would have, I just don't know. There probably would have been a way to do what you're saying. I just don't know what it is.
So we actually got a hot take from our listener, Olivia, that I think is germane to this conversation. Let's go ahead and play that now.
Hi, Sammy and Rosie. This is Olivia. My hot take is about Across the Sea, which I think is a very hot takeable episode. But I think this episode should have been structured as a Man in Black flashback episode. I think the flashes, both sideways, backward, forward, are really what made Lost unique and special. So having this episode without them just makes it feel sort of unremarkable. It doesn't really feel like Lost. I also think there's a lot in this episode that's just unnecessary. I think there's a lot of characters and moments that we just don't need to see. So I think the whole thing could have been cut down to about 20 minutes and just shown as flashbacks instead. Not to mention, we just saw Saeed's son and Jin die, and now we're just taken totally out of that emotion, and we have to watch this episode filled with these new characters and these new plot lines, and I think it just makes their deaths feel less impactful because we're trying to figure out all these new characters and stories. So I really wish we could have seen more of the other survivors really grieving their deaths immediately after. I think that would have been a lot more emotional and a lot more impactful. But anyways, love the podcast. Thanks.
So yeah, I think this is one option for what we're kind of talking about here, is that what if this were a Man in Black flashback episode, or maybe a Man in Black and Jacob flashback episode? If we think about, is it the second to last episode in season 5 where we have the scene with them sitting on the beach and sharing a wine bottle?
Yeah. Not even sharing, just chatting about over Jacob. Jacob just had breakfast. Yeah. Eating fish.
So maybe it's that episode or something, and we've got some present day Jacob Man in Black. We've got some past Jacob Man in Black as children. I think Olivia's right and you're right that there are some scenes that don't necessarily advance the plot in this episode, or that maybe go on a little bit too long and we could tighten it up. And maybe that's one way. And then it's sort of in this frame of like, these are our sort of pseudo God figures. Here's what was happening in their past.
Well, I have a couple different thoughts, and maybe some of these are best saved for later, but it occurred to me while listening back to Olivia and sort of your read on that idea that, that maybe this should have been flashbacks. It could have been cool, this is just sort of random, but what if one way they could have done it is if they had both Man in Black flashbacks and Jacob flashbacks to the same events, but you saw them playing out differently through each of those characters' recollections. Like, I feel like maybe that would have played into, the sort of, this is a myth, this is, sort of legend flashback rather than this is literal. If you could have seen like a handful of the same events play out like literally differently through each of their eyes, to the point where you don't really know which version of events is literally what happened, but maybe it doesn't matter literally what happened, because what matters is how they each recall and felt about it. Right, and how they came to be the rivals that they are. Yeah. And another thing that's interesting. That just could have been one way. The mother says, go back to the point about the mother, she says at the beginning of this episode, when Claudia, the actual mother of the children, who she brutally murders with a rock, which is another thing that maybe is worth more discussion, but Claudia is asking her these questions, and she says, look, every question is just going to lead to more questions in terms of the where did you come from, what is your backstory line of questioning. And I think that kind of speaks to the idea of this episode as like, myth as well. It's like, it almost doesn't matter what came before. Like that the point is not to, keep going back and back and back and to find like the original creator of the universe or whatever. The point is to, learn how these God figures were formed. But I agree that it does with the mother. Like, so on the one hand, I like that. Yeah. That they handled it that way. But on the other, with the mother, it does leave you kind of feeling like, what is this, her character really feels like deserving to be more fleshed out. Like, Allison Janney is a very good actor. I felt like she didn't have a lot of really good, rich material to work with here. Yeah. And I kind of wish they had fleshed out the mother a bit more. Like, I don't know, so much of this episode rode on, her machinations and her trying to mold these boys into who they would become, and how she kind of fucked them up. But we get no motivation from her at all. We don't know why she's doing any of these things. I think it would have been more interesting to spend less time with them as kids. This is like coming to me as we talk, and the way we're, less time with them as kids with, child actors who are in above their heads, reading lines of dialogue that, they weren't able to handle, and more time with Titus Welliver and Mark Pellegrino as adults forming their own destinies, and not like being 43-year-old men being manipulated by their mother. I just think that might have been more interesting. Yeah. No, I agree, because the scenes that are best in this episode are when the Man in Black is building the frozen donkey wheel and he explains it. I think that's a really powerful scene. The scene where he and Jacob are meeting as adults and where he throws the knife and explains, we found a way off this island. That's a great scene. And then I think the scene where Jacob is sitting outside, right? It's all the stuff with them as adults. The kid stuff is like expository, and that's fine, but does it add much? Yeah, I don't. I don't know. Seeing those two great actors play off of each other, and I get that the mother is the starting point, but I think I wish that, if they weren't going to flesh out the mother, like give me less of her trying to manipulate them and them like reacting to her, and more of them doing their own thing and figuring out what they want. I think that might have been more interesting. What if, like, I think the literal introduction of the mother is what makes this sort of confusing, because
every character we have on Lost is a real person, and that's the point. Even Jacob and the Man in Black are real people, and that's what makes it so interesting. And so our instinct is to read the mother as a real person as well, when she's really more of this like goddess figure who's, you know, when I think about like, maybe if we didn't see her at all, it would be easier to read it that way.
Maybe, or if we'd seen her less. I do think it's interesting. I mean, the whole construct where, you know, the Man in Black was her favorite and, you know, really the one that she wanted to take her place. And Jacob was like, you know, sort of the second fiddle, always trying to please her and show that he was really worthwhile. And I mean, the whole thing where she diverged into the two of them, right? Where he adopted her view of like, you know, he ultimately agreed to be the protector of the island, but seemingly did so only out of a desire to prove himself. He literally says, I don't care about the island. Like, those are words that Jacob says. So to see that he was kind of roped into this against his will because he just wanted so badly to please his mother and prove that he was, you know, the worthy son. And to see that despite him, you know, disappointing her and not wanting for himself what she wanted for him, that he adopted the same fundamental worldview as she did about people being fundamentally evil and corrupt, whereas Jacob seemed to think people were fundamentally good. To see that dichotomy play out and to see different parts of her, you know, develop in each of her children. I mean, that to me was interesting, how they reacted to her and how that shaped who they were. I guess I don't mean to say that I don't think that story should have been in there, but whether they showed her or not, at the very least, I think we could have used less of that. I think that's what we agree on here.
Yeah.
We just didn't need all of those scenes at the beginning. I would have, you know, settled for one or two of them.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're right. What ultimately matters to the story is how this impacted the boys. The mother's motivations don't really matter that much, right? Like,
no.
Unless you are trying to read the entire like mythology of Lost, which there's just not space for at this point in the show's architecture. And
I feel like there are a lot of scenes where you just spend the scene wondering, why is the mother doing this and what's going on with her? Like I spent several scenes wondering, like, what is, like, you know, just thinking about her strategy. Like, what is she's lying to them and telling them there's no other people on the island, there's no world out there. Like, how does she think she's going to keep that one, you know, when she's letting them run around the island and there are other people around? Like, she didn't think that one through. And, you know, how is she justifying to herself murdering Claudia is one that I was wondering about. Like, what happened to her that made her, you know, become this type of person? Like, you know, I was also curious, why is she ready to die at the end? I mean, she says thank you to the Man in Black after he kills her.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly she's tired. I mean, she's older and she's tired and she's ready to go, but there's something more going on there that I think has to do with, you know, whatever long history she's been through in this place. And it just feels like the episode is holding back on that front. And yeah, I think we probably shouldn't have had to worry about that at all.
Yeah. I mean, you and I are both reporters. And I know something that I have said as an editor many times is like, if you don't have the room in this story to like fully explore this point, cut it and let's put it in a new story. And I think maybe that's what applies here is like, there just isn't space. They're trying to do too much in this episode. And if there isn't space to explore this character fully, especially with a fantastic actor like Allison Janney, who does bring complexity to it, then probably we should just cut it. You know?
I couldn't agree with you more. So let's talk about Jacob, though. How interesting is it that, you know, the godlike protector of the island who everyone has spent the whole show like either worshiping or being afraid of or wanting to murder, didn't want the job to begin with, said he didn't care about the island, and literally, like, unless he's learned a bunch of stuff on his own over the last, you know, however many 2,000 years, like, he didn't know jack shit.
Still doesn't super know why he's doing it.
No, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's fascinating. Like, he asked what's down there, and she's like, life, death, rebirth. And, you know, then, you know, oh, if it goes out here, it goes out everywhere. But it's like he just, I don't think he knew very well what was going on. He probably formulated his own ideas over 2,000 years of doing this job, but that's all they were, his own best guesses. I don't think he knew any more than somebody like John Locke did with any certainty.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And it's interesting that you bring up John Locke, because I think there are moments in this episode that feel like parallels to the Jack and John relationship. I think about the Man in Black as a teen boy who's like pestering his mom with questions.
And where did we come from? You and your brother came from me, and I came from my mother.
Where is she?
She's dead.
What's dead?
Something you will never have to worry about.
And that felt very Jack to me, right?
Ah.
Like that felt like Jack captured by the others asking for an explanation as to what's this, why is it this way? And it's not a perfect analogy. It doesn't map perfectly onto the other, but there are times when John is asking a lot of questions and demanding a lot of answers, and then there are times when John sort of receives his marching orders or what he thinks are his marching orders and carries them out. And typically he is happy to do so because he wants to feel special and he wants to feel called upon, which again doesn't map perfectly onto Jacob, but
I see the comparison you're making. Yeah. I mean, definitely like Jacob is, then again, the Man in Black is literally more the man of science, right? I mean, he's investigating electromagnetism, like kind of the forerunner of the Dharma Initiative, like with the wells and the deep wheel, but like in a way, Jacob is the man of faith because he has faith in his mother and agrees to do the job. But also, again, like he said, I don't care about the island. All he really wants to do is please his mom. And I don't know, but it's interesting. I like the Jack Locke comparison.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And to your point about all Jacob wants to do is please his mom, like we've been talking all season and indeed since season 5 about how sort of flawed Jacob is really. And that his core motivation, and I guess over 2,000 years, like you said, I'm sure it's evolved, but this started from a very simple place, right? Of I was always my mom's second choice and until I wasn't. And then I sort of tried to say no, but I just ultimately didn't or couldn't. Like, I suppose there's a scenario in which they're sitting outside the waterfall with the light and Jacob could have stood up and stormed away and refused. Maybe. But he is not really given much latitude to refuse. And maybe she knows he's not going to.
Yeah, I think she's banking on that at this point. And I mean, it definitely like, it's pretty straightforward how that informs Jacob's whole thing. Like, and I think he says this in the next episode, like, I was never given a choice. I wanted to give all of you a choice. Mm-hmm. But, so on the one hand, like I'm somewhat, sympathetic to him. Like he was roped into this. He never wanted it. He felt like he had to do it to please his mother and to, make himself worthy. But, and so it's like, yeah, and I like that you wanted to give people a choice, but at the same time, like, he didn't really give people a choice. Like he just, upended their lives and kidnapped them basically, just like, and brought them to this island. And so I don't know how much of a choice is that versus, putting someone into a box, but it definitely was, I guess the way I kind of felt watching this and sort of feeling sympathy for Jacob, but also sort of not, was that like, maybe this doesn't make him like a bad person. Like he was put through all of this shit. And so, you put shit in one end, shit comes out the other end, right? Like he was abused, basically abused, like emotionally growing up. And then he became this, emotionally abusive figure later. So it's like, maybe that's just how it happens. So, maybe that doesn't make him worse than anybody else, but I think it makes him a pretty bad God.
Yeah.
Definitely not the person like, I want to be, worshiping and or trying to, run a society to please based on that.
Yeah. Or taking orders from.
Blindly.
Yeah.
Or doing what you think are the orders of that anyway. Yeah, no, it's pretty messed up. But it's just to hear him say the line,
I don't want to protect this place.
Someone has to.
I don't care.
My time is over.
Why? Why is your time over?
It has to be you, Jacob.
No, it doesn't. You wanted it to be him. But now I'm all you have.
And to realize that, like, deep down, that is probably still, maybe he learns to care about it, but that's probably still secondary to just, like, trying to prove himself to his mother and trying in his own screwed up way to feel like he's not doing to others what she did to him. It's just interesting to think about those two things being, more important to him or more central to what he's doing than caring about the island.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly, we've talked a lot about Jacob and the Man in Black's centuries-long rivalry. But this episode really demonstrates that long before they were rivals, they were friends, even maybe a little bit over their mother's objections, right? Like as kids, they were clearly very close. When the Man in Black decided he wanted to escape, he tried to bring Jacob with him. Even after he, fled to this other village, I think it's implied that Jacob visits him pretty frequently.
Yeah.
This is not a one-time thing. It seems to me, as maybe is often the case in a dynamic where a parent is emotionally abusive and both siblings are on the receiving end of that in different ways. Like they're allies in a lot of ways against their mother, but ultimately she still has too much power. Like it seems like their first loyalty, they're never able to get to a place where their first loyalties are both to one another. Jacob in particular is never able to get to that place. And I wonder if Jacob had been able to say sort of like, I choose you, brother, and like, let's do this together and let's see what happens. And let's, abandon this place together.
I would have loved to have seen that play out.
Yeah.
Jacob just seems he's so dependent on her for, like emotionally.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about his brother that he feels like he can't get that from his brother, but it's something there where she just has that ultimate hold over him.
Yeah.
It's really sad. I mean, it's sad to watch. Jacob kind of seems pathetic.
Yeah.
I feel kind of rude saying that, but
maybe pitiable is the better. Like I
maybe
pity
that's
him.
nicer. Yeah, I do. I pity him, and I just wonder what it is that he can't. He's stuck in a real bad rut here.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is probably an obvious point, and we'll talk more about this with Tucker in a bit. But this feels like an episode that's about the Man in Black and why you should be not maybe why you should be sympathetic with him, but he's the sympathetic character here, right?
I agree.
I mean, of the three of them, he's certainly the one, I think, the most sympathetic moment in the episode, and maybe, frankly, for either of these guys, ever, is when he comes back to the village and finds it destroyed, and you just see that, like, look of horrible sadness come over him, and there's that great shot that the camera circles around him, and you sort of see that the sadness very quickly morph into rage, and it's like, of course he feels that way, like, he did nothing wrong. Right. All he wanted to do was leave, and he worked for 30 years to try to make that happen after discovering that his, real mother was murdered by his fake mother. And then she killed all of his friends and took it all away. I mean, how's he supposed to react to that? It's like, what do you expect this guy to do or to become after that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have anything to add.
That's because I'm right, damn it.
No, I mean, I think you are. I think for a long time now, we have said that the Man in Black is maybe the more human of the two brothers, and that his motivations and desires are pretty easy to empathize with. Whereas Jacob's are a lot more opaque. And even now that we're starting, like, part of the big reveal here is what is motivating Jacob. And it's a desire for his mother's love, which is not relatable. I mean, that's relatable to me. I'm sure it's relatable to many people, but it's not nearly as visceral.
Yeah, same. So it's like, what are we supposed to take from that, though? Like,
right.
I mean,
what does that mean for like the end game of the show, right? Where the Man in Black is our one remaining enemy who we've spent many episodes now trying to thwart. And now we're sympathetic to him. I mean, it makes it more complex, and I'd always rather be a little bit sympathetic to the villain. But again, I wonder if this would have worked better. What if we had seen this episode before Ben killed Jacob?
Interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking it made me want to go back and rewatch that scene with Jacob and his brother interacting.
Right, because I remember when Ben kills Jacob, we talked about how, incredible scene. Ben feels like he has never received adequate love and attention from Jacob, right? Which maybe speaks to your point about Jacob being sort of unable to love in a way that he was not loved. Ben's also like his soldier or employee or something, though. So it's also, I don't know, imperfect analogies. But if we had seen this before Ben killed Jacob, I wonder if that would have made that picture more complete. It definitely would have.
Yeah. Yeah, not to say they did it in the wrong order, but it definitely
Yeah.
like takes on new layers now that you know this information.
It feels like that should be as much a climax as Jack killing the Man in Black. Because if we think about these two gods as like equal and opposing forces, both of whom need to be overthrown, right? Like, I wonder if there's a way you could have reshuffled this and like the mid-season finale is Ben killing Jacob and then the end of season is Jack killing the Man in Black or something.
Well, here's the explanation. Olivia nailed this. This should have been a Man in Black and or Jacob and Jacob and Man in Black flashback episode, and you could have done it throughout time and not just had it be their upbringing. And you could have, flashed, through the events of the show and shown things from their perspective, and like, done another scene, of Jacob, alone waiting to come and be killed, or maybe they got another moment together right afterwards somehow, or something where it builds up to that moment where you see that moment take on new meaning from each of their perspectives, and that's where the flashback ends with the killing, but seen through new eyes. Just a thought. I think that might solve what you're talking about.
Well, and this is probably something that has changed for us in the streaming era, right? The idea that writers can sit down and really sketch out in detail what's going to happen in every single episode of a season because the whole season's going to drop at once and they don't have to go week to week. And, maybe you have a little bit more control over the architecture there.
I am going to say on that note, because I agree with you, they had a very hard job, and it would be an easier job to do today in some respects. Also, they wouldn't have to produce half as many episodes. Tucker says this later, so we'll get to Tucker shortly, but he commented, and you'll hear him say this, which I think is fascinating, that even, directing this episode, he was not, super satisfied, it sounds like, or not totally satisfied with how it turns out. But he says that, but he then says that he still thinks that it was a pretty, bold and exciting gamble for the writers to take, with 3 episodes left in the show to devote an hour of space to this. And I got to say, like, I hear the complaint from, our men, we've talked about it, and we heard it on our listener hot take this week from Olivia, that idea that, one reason this episode landed so badly was because it came right after these 3 shocking deaths. And it just kind of took away from that by not dealing with them. I disagree with that. I think if this episode had really landed, and really, worked in all the ways they wanted it to work, nobody would have that complaint. I kind of like the idea of like stopping and taking a breath at that point of like this horrible thing happening and giving ourselves some space to not recover from it, but to just separate ourselves from that moment and breathe and not just be immediately, inundated again by this outpouring of grief over Sunjin and Sayid. I love the idea of dropping in this, backstory of the god figures right there. I just think the problem was they didn't pull it off quite right. I think that's a super cool idea to do that, and bold by the writers, at that point in time when you had to do it this way, to just be like, okay, time to do this episode. I just wish it had worked, a little bit better.
Yeah. I agree with you that it's bold. I think when there are 3 episodes left in this beloved series, like, I know I can feel this in my analysis as we're getting closer to the end. Like, the emotional stakes are getting heightened because I don't want it to be over. And I am being a little bit more critical of how they're using the time on screen because I want every moment to be so great, right? Whereas in season 3, when you've got, years left, it's like, oh, okay, they can fuck around in the Dharma Initiative for a while and whatever, it's fine. But now it's like, oh no, every scene counts, every moment counts. And it's a bold gamble, and it's made like 10 times as bold because as a viewer, I think you feel like, yes, you've just had these 3 super consequential deaths. You've just been crying last time you watched Lost, and then you come to this expecting maybe a little bit of catharsis, and instead you get this backstory, which, again, I agree, super, super bold choice, and maybe would have, if they had pulled it off differently, it would have landed. I'm sure, obviously, it would have landed differently, but yeah, I just don't know when I can't imagine being under that sort of pressure, right? When you have millions and millions of fans who are counting on you for answers and catharsis and resolution, and you only have a limited amount of time to pull it off. It's a tough thing to do at that point, I think, especially for a show where I think we both agree that the explanations of the mechanics and what's going on behind the scenes and the lore are interesting, but what really makes Lost beautiful for us is the characters, right? And like, all I want as a viewer at this point is like resolution for Sawyer and Jack and Kate and Hurley. And it's just tricky, man, at this point in the series, I think.
It's tricky. They definitely needed to, hit a home run or hit a grand slam on this one for it to really not, piss anybody off to be coming at this point in the show. And they hit, like a single or maybe, in parts of the episode, a double.
Again, like upon rewatch, when all of that is removed, it's not a bad episode. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here.
There's some parts that are cringy and some parts that are very, very good. Frankly, I think the parts that are really good this episode, largely thanks to Titus Welliver doing a phenomenal job with his scenes. Like Mark Pellegrino too, don't get me wrong, but like Titus really steals the show.
Yeah.
And I think, again, speaks to the idea of, as a full Man and as a real Man in Black flashback episode, this might have been even better. Yeah, I don't know. I went out to see Wakanda Forever last night, and this is the final thought on this. Something that was said twice in that movie by characters who, were like being asked to explain sort of mythological backstory type things was each of them said, someone would ask, why is that the case? Or how did that happen? They would say, well, the how is less important than the why. And I think that principle, applies to the point you're making here and to this episode and to everything we've been saying over this conversation, which is that to the extent that they could have focused this episode less on the mechanics of how the Man in Black and Jacob came to be and more on the why of, how and why they did certain things and, their conflict played out in certain ways, I think that would have been beneficial. Not that this episode didn't have any of that, but I think it could have benefited from being, more tightly focused in that way.
Yeah.
Anyway, should we talk to the guy who directed it?
Absolutely, we should. As Sammy mentioned, we had Tucker Gates on the podcast early in season 6 talking about The Substitute. He also directed Apaterno. So we're going to start this conversation talking about Apaterno. Of course, we had Nestor Carbonell on to talk about that episode. So we saved this for now, but still a great conversation. And Tucker brings a lot of fascinating insights to it.
Let's talk about Apaterno. Your big Nestor Carbonell, Richard Alpert flashback episode. When we talked to Nestor about this, he, all the sequences, there's all sorts of cinematic shots of him, riding a horse across the Canary Islands and getting tossed on the ship. And he described it as like making a film. And I know you've kind of already used that description about Lost in general, but he thought this one was especially cinematic. In what went into it and in what it produced. What do you think about that? Do you feel like it's,
I felt the same way. I mean, I felt it was like the episode that kind of, I was able to really capture that the most. It's kind of fun because the beginning of it is so melodramatic, and sort of, I love that, it's like this, Spanish soap opera, it's like really, and to be honest, like Nestor just gave his all to it. He lost so much weight. He like grew a beard. I had a cousin who was living next door to him on the island, and their kids played together, and my cousin's kids wouldn't go near him, because they thought he was, I think when my cousin's kids walked up and goes, stranger danger, stranger danger, she didn't recognize him anymore. But he really gave his all. And that again is like what was kind of so fun about the show was that, every episode you got, a different actor's episode. And so it was their time to shine. And so they would give so much to it. But Nestor on that one gave so much to it. And there were so many great opportunities in that episode. I mean, there were, like, as a director, you look for opportunities. There were so many opportunities that were great there. And we really got to push it. The place where they were under the tree was such a beautiful location, going over the valley to shoot the scene with Jacob and the Man in Black at the end, and the beach with the foot statue, all those things are so big and cinematic. And a lot of times on the show, especially in the middle seasons, it would get very close-up-y, I thought, because it was all about sort of the psychological drama of the show. And here we were really allowed to get sort of big and cinematic. And I really embraced that and got really excited about it. I really did. And when you do that and you have an actor like Nestor who's really given his all, then it really, it was really fun to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my best times.
You mentioned how much fun you had working in those scenes that are filmed in the shipwreck. Same. I'd love to hear more about that. I know Nestor talked about that too, as scenes that were like really intense because it's just him by himself.
It's just him, and we're throwing everything at him. We're putting a wild boar in the set with him. We're putting a fake boar in the set with him. It's like he's always. The funny thing is like the real boar was in there, and he's like chained to the wall. He's like, I can't move. I'm like, I know. Just stay still. Hopefully it won't charge you. Yeah,
it's an amazing sequence. It goes on for like 11 minutes of screen time. Like it's real intense, and talk about what you were trying to do with that stuff.
Well, we were trying to make it as exciting as possible and as sort of dynamic as possible. We shot a lot of very low angle stuff, because he was chained and on the floor for most of it. So we used a prism lens a lot for that, to keep the lens as close to the ground as possible. And, because, I always, we have such a low ceiling because the nature of the ship, and I love that. So it always gives us this confinement and having the skylights, into it, allowed us, to bring elements of light and smoke and water into the set. And it just, we wanted to abuse Nestor as much as possible.
That's very funny.
Yeah.
But was there a particular way you wanted viewers to feel watching all that, or to feel coming out of it? I mean, I can speak for myself and to say that I felt like I was stuck in a ship for a long time at the end of it.
Well, yeah, and that you're alone, right? And that you're alone and you're abandoned, is sort of the thing too, right? It's like, so as much as it's this whole ship, it's a personal journey, and I think, you have only yourself and your will to survive is, kind of the things we're trying to sell.
Yeah.
I can't imagine, being in that situation and being chained and having no recourse, and just hoping that the ship stays together, and doesn't fall apart and you drown,
Yeah. I was just going to say the episode is sort of bookended by these scenes on the island in the present day where Richard is talking about his belief that he is in hell, and how he has sort of, it's kind of revealed that he's been battling with this belief or suspecting it in the back of his mind for 140 years.
Yeah. And I love that scene at the end where he's, where he's there and then his wife shows up, and he can't see her. And it was one of my favorite, like, I'm really like with visual effects and stuff, I'm really into trying to do everything as practical as possible and not do CG and all that kind of stuff. And it was one of my favorite things when we went, when we were on one side and then we came to the other side and she was gone, right? And it was just like, she just ducked, like, I'm like, we're going to do it this way. We're going to go behind his head and she's just going to duck. So we had to do it a bunch of times so that you could get the timing exactly right and go quick enough. And then she did the rest of the scene like lying on the ground.
Right, because you pull that shot behind Jorge Garcia's head, and it's only for a second. You're on one side of his head.
Only for a second. We come out on the other side. She's not there, and she just was a really fast ducker. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what? Since we're talking about that scene, one other choice that I was interested about there is that at the beginning of the scene, because Hurley is translating for them, right? Because he can hear and see the the dead wife, and Nestor cannot. So
he can speak Spanish,
and he can speak Spanish as well. So the first like one or two lines, you sort of see Hurley doing the translation, and then after that, it's like for the next few lines, they're just talking directly to each other. My interpretation of that was that you made a choice that it was just going to flow better and be more impactful if you cut out the Hurley parts, and I read it as assumed that he's really still translating, but you're not showing that. Was that what you were going for there?
I think so, but I think it was also what the writers were going for. I think that's sort of I think that's the way that it was written too. Okay. I think, because I think it's like one of those things where it's an emotional scene, right? So the reality of the scene is not the reality of what you're seeing. It's an emotional reality rather than and I think that's what we're going for there. And I think there's an intimacy to it that I think, to eliminate the third party, it really helps the intimacy of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to go back for a minute to Rosie's question about the being in hell part stuff, I was curious about that as well. Like, this episode has really strong religious overtones. Like, Richard thinks he's in hell. He badly wants absolution. Like, his request to Jacob that couldn't be granted was absolve me of my sins. And
right,
there's this idea of, is the man in black the devil? Is Jacob the devil? Just kind of curious what you made of all that, and what, if anything, you were trying to do with that, because it kind of pervades the episode, this whole religious thing.
It does, and I was, to be honest with you, I wasn't really sure the specific roles, at that point, between Man in Black and Jacob were, who was evil and who wasn't. And I think that's what's so interesting, is that sort of dichotomy of each character. There's good and bad in both of them. I mean, I love Titus. I love Titus's character, and like, maybe he's just a really good bad guy, or maybe he's the guy that you really like, or maybe he's the one that's going to get you off the island or get you what you want, and maybe Jacob in his righteousness is the wrong path, because, won't get you anywhere, it's interesting that way. And they're both terrific actors in that, and they're kind of perfect for their roles, it's that kind, to me, you're right. It has tremendous religious tones, but, it could go from any type of religion where it's like good and evil, within a Catholic or Christian religion, or it could go to, are we balancing, are we on the island trying to balance, be the balance between the good and bad gods? And is that our role, so that's where my college education finally came into, use.
Yeah. I mean,
but I think I love that, stuff. And it's really interesting. And I mean, obviously there's real Catholic overtones in the sort of, the Spanish story and the melodrama of that, and the cross that, the crucifix that's hidden, that's buried under the bench. But I think, there is that quality that I kind of got from it, with Man in Black and Jacob, that maybe it was the job of all these islanders, to keep the balance.
That's an interesting idea, that rather than it was just about defeating one side or the other, that they needed to be in balance. I kind of like that thought.
Yeah. Well, and arguably that's what the whole "we're here to keep the cork in the bottle" sequence is about.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Like, we need to.
That's what's so fun about this kind of
force.
stuff. Yeah. And you can make of it what you can find in it, too. And each of the specific, islanders have their own take on it. But, to me, that's what I kind of took, when they both come and sit on the bench together at the end, it is that kind of thing where they're like brothers to me. They're not, they're enemies, but they're brothers, they're eternally tied, when Jacob and the Man in Black sit on the log at the end, up on the hill.
At the end of Abaturno, where they're talking about,
where he hands him the bottle
Richard.
of wine, and he breaks the bottle of wine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You mentioned this, but just, Titus Welliver and Mark Pellegrino, both really good, great actors to work with, I imagine. Do you remember anything in particular from them on the set?
Titus and I just became good friends. I just love, I just love working with him. He's just got such a great look and a great delivery. He can play a mobster. He can play the Man in Black. He can do it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really fun. Yeah.
I think this transitions us really well into what's going on in Across the Sea.
Yeah.
Which, Tucker, I know you didn't have a chance to watch, but it's like Abaturno, it's this really distinctive episode that sort of takes us away from the day-to-day action. And
it's interesting because it's working a lot with the regulars. It's working with people that aren't really a part of the show. And that's always a really difficult process, because sometimes it can be insanely great because it's this new life into this, sort of a well-established palette, and sometimes it can be a little bit rough because people aren't quite fitting into the palette. I mean, with these actors, it was not an issue at all, but it just is, it's always an interesting thing as a director to try and see, create a way for it to fit into this world that is so well defined, especially at that point.
Yeah.
Do you remember what your reaction to this was, like when you first read the script, like how you felt going into this thing?
Well, I mostly felt a lot of pressure because I knew we were getting towards the end, and they, because Abaturno had gone so well, they brought me in to do this one. So it's like, oh shit, it's sort of like trying to do a repeat performance in a certain way. And that's always kind of frightening as a director. You always sort of want to try and do something new each time, but I was nervous about it. I was really nervous.
Yeah.
And kind of wondering, how they were going to wrap things up, what it really was all about. I'm still wondering a little bit.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember this, but the episode, it doesn't even start like a typical episode of Lost. There's no previously on Lost. There's no setup scene. Like, we just open cold on these characters who the audience doesn't know at that point.
Yeah, I think that was definitely done on purpose, just to try and shake things up and sort of cue the audience into that they're going somewhere a little bit different on this episode. Yeah.
Did you? I mean, what was it like? You got not only Titus Welliver and Mark Pellegrino back, but you work with Allison Janney in this episode. Playing this key role. Talk about that and bringing her in a little bit.
So it was for me that was super exciting because I had never worked with her before, and I just love her. I think she's so talented, and it was really fun. And that was a really funny thing for her because she's coming from all these sort of really, I wouldn't say traditional, but like sort of, well ingrained television shows and not just television shows, but theater and movies and work. And then all of a sudden she's, sitting on the beach in these sort of funny clothes and having to be part of Lost. And she's like Mama Lost, after that, it's like, and so we sort of had a good laugh about that. But it was really fun. She's so good. And again, it's like sort of the island is so funny. It's like we were shooting this scene with her where she's sitting on a log on the beach. And while we were setting up, she was sitting there and this sea turtle came up out of the ocean and just crawled right up to her feet and then just sat in the sand right by her feet. And we just shot the whole scene with this sea turtle that had just crawled up like right to her feet. I'm like, this is like the gifts of the gods, it's like, it's so funny. You really are Mama Lost, you're like, the mother of all Lost. It's great.
That's
so
funny.
I love working with her.
I remember in the episode seeing a shot of a sea turtle on the beach and thinking, I've never seen that in Lost before.
It was completely random. It just happened.
Okay.
It was
That's funny.
Yeah.
There's Allison Janney, and then of course there are the two kids whose names I have written down here somewhere: Kenton Duty and Ryan Bradford, playing the young Jacob in The Man in Black. They're in the first half of the episode before you move on to the adult actors. Do you have any particular recollection of working with them or what that was like?
I mean, it's interesting because that's always. I think it's one of the hardest things to do as a director is to work with kids and to work with kids who are actually playing younger characters of established characters. So you're trying to sort of imbue with them certain traits and yet trying to keep them, I'll just say, from acting too much, because that's sort of the kind of what happens a lot when you're working with younger actors is, either, they're staying up late at home with their parents the night before and their parents are telling them, you got to do this and you got to do that, or it's just part of being young and not being, having enough experience in your craft to be able to be kind of loose and natural, and so we're always sort of trying to find ways to make that happen. And I think what helped there was that, we were kind of out in nature and out in the environment. And I tried to kind of keep it as loose as possible and kind of on their level as possible and not be too complicated with, anything that I was trying to give them in terms of direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess part of what I was wondering there, and I don't want to say anything unkind about anyone, but it's difficult, as you said. You're bringing child actors into this who haven't done this show before, and they haven't done these roles, and they're suddenly playing this like super, super key, part, revealing the long hidden backstory of the crucial characters. And I guess
a lot of pressure.
I guess I wonder to what extent that might have something to do with some of the reception this episode got among fans was pretty polarizing, and you had a lot of folks who, were really unhappy about it. In retrospect, watching it back now, I like it a lot, and in fact, a lot more than I did at the time, I think. But I wonder how much of it might have to do with, bringing in young actors to play this super crucial role and doing something so totally different, for the first half of this. I just wonder about that a little bit.
I mean, it might be that. It might just have been my lousy direction. It's like I don't know, but I kind of felt the same way about the episode. I walked away being kind of unsatisfied with what I had done and what we had been able to do.
But why is that? What were you unsatisfied by?
Successful. I don't know. I mean, it's not something that like you can really pinpoint. And like, the beautiful thing about like kind of what we do is like, you spend all your days and you're in this like kind of, funnel, you're just looking straight ahead and you're just got your head down and you're doing the work and trying to make the best of what's right in front of you at that moment and trying to anticipate what's coming and sort of keep it in line with what you've done. And you never really know kind of how it's going to work until it's all put together. And that's kind of the beauty of it, because there's some things I've done where I thought it was absolutely horrible and it's turned out great. And there's some things I thought were absolutely great and they haven't been so good. And so it's just kind of what happens in the process. And I think it was a real gamble by the writers, and I have to give them real credit for, really pushing and trying to push the envelope a little bit with the show, to do something that kind of outside the lanes of what they've been doing, right? Especially when you're running up to the end, it's like, and so, those guys are really, they're super talented and they're really ballsy and they have a lot of fun doing it. I remember at the beginning of the season, being on the Disney lot and giving Damon a little bit of shit. I go, Damon, how are you going to finish this thing? He's like, well, I know I'm going to finish it. I just don't know how I'm going to get there. It's like, and so, we're all trying to figure it out as we do it. And sometimes it's more successful than other times. And maybe the success that Abaturno had kind of influenced everybody. And so maybe it didn't become its own thing quite as much as maybe it should have been. I don't know. Whether that's from my direction or from the writers or whatever it is, it's just like, maybe we were trying to duplicate something and sometimes it's better to do something new,
Yeah.
That's
really interesting because I think the reason Abaturno lands so well for me is that Richard is this character that we as viewers have known for 4 or 5 years.
He's kind of an enigma, and then he just opens up and this like blows up in this thing.
Yeah. Whereas Jacob and the Man in Black are much further removed. They're almost like gods. They're not. They're harder. There's harder nuts to crack because they are the gods. So it becomes a much more philosophical kind of discussion, and not. And I think with Nestor, he's still on your side. He's sort of part of the audience. He's the one who's trying to figure it out and who's paranoid and freaked out by it all. He's not one of the puppet masters. He's one of the puppets, Yeah. Well, I think Across the Sea does a lot to, at least for me, to make me empathize with the Man in Black more and to see him as more human and more easier to relate to. And
I think Titus is really good at that. That's what I love about him, because he's really seductive in a certain way,
Yeah. Whereas Jacob is still this sort of law-abiding, rule-following.
That's right. It's sort of like the righteous one versus the bad boy, I guess.
Yeah, and that was something that really surprised me about Across the Sea, and one of the reasons why I think in retrospect especially I enjoy this. Like you go in thinking this is going to be the episode about how Jacob became the good guy and how the Man in Black became the bad guy. But in reality, watching it, at least for me, I feel very sympathetic that Titus wants to leave the island and his mother just won't let him go. He was the one who was sort of the special one, and Jacob, as Rosie said, the law-abiding. And Jacob's kind of annoying by the end. You know, he's
Right.
43 years old and living with his mom and doing everything he can to impress her with his good weaving, which is a little bit sad. And I don't know. And the man in black is just working so hard and trying so hard to leave. I just thought it was really interesting what you did with the dynamic between those characters. And I'm curious your thoughts about that, the relationship with each other and with the mother.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're outlining is actually sort of really traditional tropes. You know, they're really, I mean, this is like sort of down through all mythology. This is kind of, these are pretty traditional, you know, takes on these characters, you know, and it's interesting. And like, to me, like, I love it because it's sort of in all of us. It's the sort of brother thing, you know, whether it's in Faulkner or it's in, you know, wherever it is, it's always this struggle between, you know, siblings for attention and for life, and one is favored more than the other. I mean, these are all like the real, you know, the meat of kind of every play and every movie and every story we've ever seen. And so I think for the writers to sort of elevate the show into that, I thought was really interesting and fun. And you know, I hope we did it justice. It just, you know, it's fun. You know, it's just, you know, I mean, to me, like, I love those kinds of scenes and working with them on that level. I mean, I do think that, you know, Pellegrino is like, he's perfect for that role because he is a little bit tight, you know, he can play that tightness really well, you know.
But what do you mean by tight?
Well, he wants it so bad, so he's always trying to do the right thing, you know. He's always trying to be on the righteous side, you know. And so, I mean, tight in that way, you know. And you know, and Titus is a little bit looser, a little bit. He'll throw you that look that you're not expecting, or that little grin, and there's a mischief behind it, you know. And I think there's envy, but you know, that I think that, you know, Jacob feels so much envy, you know, for who Titus's character, the Man in Black, is, you know, in a certain way. And so I think, you know, any appreciation that he gets from his mother and any sort of righteous feeling he feels for doing the right thing is kind of, it doesn't add up to like kind of the fun of being Titus, you know, the glamour of being Titus's character, the Man in Black, the freedom in certain sense to want more, you know, to feel like that you can have that.
Tucker, the point you were making about Jacob having this jealousy of the Man in Black because he was, you know, he had his own ambitions and he was cool and he wasn't just under the thumb of the mother and he was out trying to, you know, do something new and exciting and different. It made me think about John Locke as well, because you made the comparison earlier that I thought was really interesting, that, you know, Locke and the Man in Black maybe had some similarities, that both of them were trying to expand beyond, you know, the limits that the world was placing on them and, you know, striving for something more and something, you know, something that others would tell them they can't do or they're not capable. You know, the whole "don't tell me what I can't do" thing. So now I'm thinking of Jacob and the Man in Black, maybe a little bit like Locke and Jack early in the show, where Jack was kind of the by the book, you know, hero type, like, okay, we've crashed on this island. It's my job to get us off of it. And, you know, I don't know if he would have had jealousy of Locke, but Locke was definitely taking a very different approach of, no, maybe there's another way to look at this. Maybe we're meant for this. Maybe we should explore the exciting aspects of this. I feel like there's maybe something similar here in the way you're describing Jacob and his brother.
I think it's true. And I think you can draw those lines to almost all the characters. But I think, with Jack especially, you know, I didn't do a lot of work with his character, but I, you know, in seeing the other episodes, you know, it's like he's definitely trapped in his sense of responsibility, you know, of being a doctor, of being the one who can save people, and being in that mode. It's the mode of saving rather than the mode of living, you know. And it's interesting because both he and Locke are definitely authority figures, but they're definitely different authority figures.
Very
I think
different
that's
ways,
kind of interesting what you're saying.
Yeah.
Saving versus living. That's really interesting. Yeah. You know, the character of the mother, who we haven't talked about that much. I mean, right away, she, you know, the first thing we see her do basically is she delivers these two children. She helps this woman deliver her two children, and then she beats her head in with a rock. kills the mother so that she can steal the children for herself. I guess how did you think about like building sympathy for getting people to care about that character after this, if that matters at all? Because I mean, it's just such a horrible thing she does right away, and then you kind of base an episode around it after that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know this, but I imagine it comes from a story and myth. I would imagine something like that does, but I don't think it's important to, at least within the confines of the particular scene, to establish the sympathy. But perhaps, as the show progresses, to sort of try and build some empathy for the character. And I think you can do that just by making them dimensional. And in some ways, there's a certain thing that they're fighting to get out from underneath, both of them in a certain sense, and that is that sort of terror of the mother, and I mean, I don't know how else to speak to it except that. I mean, it was a kind of gruesome act. I think it challenges the actor, and it challenges the director and the writer to try and sort of flesh out something beyond that once you start with that. But I think she still is the mother, and she still does care for her kids, and she still has a certain element, but she also wants control.
Yeah, and now, I mean, I think that Allison Janney really brings all of that stuff out. I mean, she communicates all of it really well, because I definitely don't like her character, but I feel I feel by the end that at least I understand her.
Right.
Do you the other thing in this episode I want to ask about, the scenes at the heart of the island with that light emanating out of the like that sort of stream flowing down towards the big bright light where she takes them as children, and then you remember this stuff? They're supposed to protect this place.
Yes, the fake waterfall. Yeah, the waterfall, right, where the light was coming out of.
The fake waterfall. Basically, I'm just kind of wondering, like, it's stuff that on the surface I think could be read as very silly. This big shiny light at the end of a little stream, and they, when she passes the leadership on to Jacob, she says this like incantation and passes him a little cup to drink from. Like, it's. I guess I'm curious how you handled this as a director and tried to make it, work and feel serious when there was a lot of, sort of. Yeah,
it was a little cheesy. I mean, that whole element was really difficult for us. I mean, one, I think we had hoped that we were going to find, an actual location that we could use. But there weren't any on the island. We would have had to have gone to another island to do it.
You mean any waterfalls like that?
Yeah. And I think they felt like by building it, we'd have more control. And a lot of those decisions are kind of made before you get there as a director, so you kind of have to sort of work your way around it and, do the best with it that you can. But I don't remember it that well, to be honest with you. But, I think that, you're, in all these situations when it can verge that way, you just try and ground it as much as possible and make it sort of believable as much as possible. And hopefully you've got, really great actors that can help you with that.
Yeah. Yeah. The very last thing I was wondering, this episode takes place like in ancient times, right? Like it's supposed to be, it's not clear, but they're speaking Latin at the beginning. Was there anything in particular that you remember doing or trying to do to sort of place this episode in time or show that it was ancient? It's sort of the same question with Abaturno from the 1860s, but this was, maybe thousands of years.
Yeah, I mean, the advantage that we had with Abaturno was we had the ship, and I think the ship really sort of, and the sort of the prison, and those sort of those iconic kind of elements really helped us. It was much more difficult, with this to try and do that, and so we just sort of played the island for what it was, and that was much more difficult with this one than it was with Abaturno, because Abaturno we had sort of a lot of elements that could help us, whether it was the building, where the doctor lived, things like that sort of maintained an architecture and a sort of, elements that would be believable for that time. And it sort of helped set the tone for it, when you're in that sort of bare, sort of undefined time, it's much more difficult to do, you know.
We ask everybody this. We know it's been 15 years since Lost was sort of actively being made. Where does it figure into your career now? You know, everybody who worked on the show has gone on to do a million other things. What are your recollections of it, and what does it mean to you?
Well, it means a lot to me on a lot of different levels. You know, one, it sort of planted me sort of in JJ's camp for a while, you know, which was really helpful for my career. On a personal level, it really was kind of defining for me in terms of being a director. You know, it's like in some ways I really sort of stepped up a little bit, I felt like, with my directing with the show. It was also a great experience. Like personally, I just loved it. I loved working with the crew. I loved working with the island crew. They're just such good people, and so I just had so much fun working there. And then for me, for my family, I mean, it was like my family's favorite job, you know, because they'd come out to Hawaii and spend the time, and it was also a show that, you know, I had 3 daughters at the time. It was a show that we sat down and watched as a family too. And it was really fun to watch as a family. And so I remember it on all different levels, on a production level, on relationships with writers, and, you know, went on to work, you know, with Carlton on Bates Motel. You know, it's been a thing where, you know, it's sort of worked in so many different ways. It was, you know, yeah, I mean, just a great experience all around.
I know we've asked, you know, about a lot of different specifics, but any final memories or recollections from the set, or fun or crazy things that happened that haven't come up that you'd want to share?
I'm trying to think. Oh, I don't know. So, I just remember like being on the set, and every time you were on the set directing and the next script would come out, it's like all the actors would just freak out and go through it really fast to see if they were getting killed. And when we were in the first season, when they were building the raft, I was just like, I would always just go to them and just be like, hey, whatever you do, just don't get on the raft, you know, because if you get on the raft, you're off the show, you know. Just don't get on the raft, you know.
That's funny. Turned out to not be correct, but funny.
That's not true at all. Yeah, I was completely wrong about that.
Yeah, that's great. Wrong. Tucker, what last thing, what are you working on now?
I've been working on several different things. I just did I've been doing morning show quite a bit now. And I just did Terminal List with Chris Pratt. Just finished American Gigolo. And I've been doing a bunch of commercials and then doing some writing on my own. So
yeah,
got a lot of things going. Yeah.
So folks, that's a lot of different places you can see Tucker's work these days. And I will say for myself, I finally just started watching the first season of The Morning Show. Excited to see what comes next. Nestor is so good in that. That whole cast is so good. Nestor
is good. Yeah. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah. No, I've been really fortunate. I've been able to work with a lot of great people in a lot of great parts of the world. And Hawaii was definitely one of them.
Yeah, I think Tucker really distills it well when he says that the Man in Black's character is just like inherently more seductive as a viewer. Like we are more attracted to and we relate better to the ideas of like seeking freedom and independence more than familial obligation, which does seem true and seems like consistent with everything we've talked about over the last season. At the same time, I think there's more that they could have done to make me empathize with the familial obligation stuff, but that's okay.
Yeah. No, and sorry, that just reminds me of one point that I meant to go back to earlier, just the point about, you know, humans being evil and flawed and just the bad stuff that the Man in Black does. Like, I don't know, just it feels like everyone's debating, are humans good or are humans bad? And in reality, like everyone across the board is doing both, obviously, right? I mean, we see the mother, you know, who's like, oh, we're not like them, you know, they're cruel and they're corrupt and they kill, and then she goes and fucking murders them all. But sorry, this was related to your point. Yeah, sympathetic to the Man in Black, but then like now in the present day, he wants to kill everybody, and he's trying to kill all of our heroes. And like on the one hand, I feel like it follows logically. I went back and I checked the dialogue from Abaturno where he's just begging Jacob, like, why don't you just let me leave? And Jacob says, well, while I'm alive, that's not going to happen. And the Man in Black says, and Jacob says, even if you do manage to kill me, somebody else will take my place. And the Man in Black's response is, then I'll kill them too. And it's like, it's logical, right? Like it steps, logically from one point to the other of how he gets to this point of, well, that's why I've got to kill everybody. But it's, it's like, it's the same as the mother who feels like, well, because she's, because her cause is worthwhile and she's got an island to protect, like it's okay for her to do this thing that she would criticize others for. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like, I don't know, it's just this whole big thing about everyone justifying their evil deeds in different ways. And I don't know, I'm talking myself in circles here. But yes, as to your point about, yes, he's sympathetic, but not totally so. It's like, yes, but same for everybody. Mm-hmm. Maybe we needed a whole season of these guys with flashback episodes. Maybe it was just too much for one episode to handle, where they were trying to lay out that wonderful, rich complexity that I think is contained within these characters, and also do the sort of mythology world-building aspect at the same time, and to do it all in 45 minutes. Maybe that was too tall an order. Yeah. Like I said earlier, I thought it was interesting that, Tucker, even on reflection, expressed some lack of satisfaction here. And he made that, we asked about the waterfall, that kind of, awkward looking, light in the, light at the end of the fake waterfall. And, I thought it was, he made the comment that they couldn't find a waterfall on the island that they were on. There would have been a good one on another island and it just would have been too expensive. I forget if he said that or implied that, but it just made me think like, man, I know they must have been saving up for the budget for the finale at this point. Like other people have told us that the finale kind of killed their budget that last year. My God, if they could have just spent and gone over to another island, like that would have worked so much better.
See, I didn't actually think the waterfall was that cheesy.
I thought it was.
I mean, it was always going to be cheesy, though, is how I felt about it. Like, I was already going along with the concept that inside this waterfall there is some powerful supernatural light that contains life, death, and rebirth or whatever. I can deal with it if it looks a little bit, setty. But
that's fine.
You're not wrong.
Where I thought the light wasn't cheesy was in the well that the Man in Black and his compatriots had dug. That was super freaking cool, where he pulled the block that he had carved out of the brick, and suddenly the light just shone through and glowed through. That was beautiful. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was really well done.
Yeah. We'll we've got 2 episodes of Lost here to go. I can't believe it.
Wow.
I know we've been on this every 2-week schedule for this last season, and thank you for bearing with us while we drag this out. We're both pretty busy. We've got some exciting things planned for the last couple weeks, and we want to give you the best that we got. So we're gonna try our very best to do it on the normal 2-week schedule here. It might be a little delayed, not sure yet, but if you don't see it in your feed, check our social media, Twitter at The Hatch Podcast, Facebook.com/The Hatch Podcast. And if it's not there in the feed on the right day, we'll have an update for you on what's going on and when you can expect us.
We are also hoping to do something kind of fun and interesting and different with The New Man in Charge, which was a season 6 DVD extra, right? I have actually never seen it because I have never been in possession of the season 6 DVDs. So I'm hoping to watch it for the first time, and we'll chat about it. Hopefully we'll chat with all of you about it. Stay tuned for more detail about what form that's going to take. You'll know when we know.
In the meantime, never too late to leave us a nice review or a rating on your podcast app of choice. Wherever you listen, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart. Let us know what you think of the show. We love hearing from you.
We would love to play your hot takes for these last 2 episodes. You can leave those at 9546 Dharma. If you're outside the U.S., just use the country code 1, and you can also send a voice memo to our Facebook page.
Our theme music is by Andy G. Cohen, and our cover art is by Danny Roth.
We'll be back soon.
Namaste.